Tom Bowen had spent the last 2 decades building a life that revolved around consistency, clear boundaries, and a quiet form of discipline forged not from trauma, but from experience. He was not a recluse, not a mystery man with secrets or shadows. Rather, he was a man of structure, someone who found comfort in maritime charts, tide tables, maintenance logs, and the unmistakable rhythm of dock ropes tightening under pressure. After years in municipal coastal development and property infrastructure management, he had chosen to settle down near a modest inlet, buying a narrow but legally designated waterfront parcel just outside a former fishing town that had slowly transitioned into a haven for weekend boaters, second-home investors, and, more recently, suburban retirees who desired coastal aesthetics without the inconvenience of actual sea life. His house was nothing extravagant. A clean 2-story home with hardy siding, salt-resistant shutters, and a wraparound porch facing a strip of water that some real estate brochures tried to elevate with words like canal or bay extension. But, which Tom knew, with no delusions, was a dredged-out holding trench linked to the tidal basin via a rusted floodgate. It wasn't pretty, but it was legal. More importantly, the dock behind it was his, permitted, registered, surveyed, and maintained with the kind of exactitude that would bore most people to tears. But for Tom, it was a quiet declaration of order, of control, of earned space. The dock, reinforced with marine-grade pilings and composite decking, was licensed with the county under a private use declaration filed nearly 10 years prior. Tom had renewed it every 2 years on schedule, never once missing a compliance report. He kept the maintenance logs in plastic sleeves inside a binder, alongside copies of his permit, title deeds, and an annotated aerial map that included utility lines, easement boundaries, and even shadow projections for winter solstice sun paths. He had no interest in flaunting ownership. He simply valued knowing where things stood. The slip itself wasn't large, just enough for his 23-foot fiberglass skiff, a working boat that didn't shine or sparkle but could handle offshore current and shallows alike. It was moored with double fenders and 2-point anchoring. Nothing was left to chance. Tom didn't live alone, but he lived self-reliantly. His neighbors knew him as the guy who fixed his own seawall and once corrected a county inspector who misquoted a subclause on erosion controls. He wasn't feared or revered, but he was respected in that low-volume, not-across-the-driveway kind of way. He paid into the local property council like everyone else, but never attended the barbecues or petition meetings. Not out of arrogance, simply because he didn't need to. Until recently, he'd never had a reason to question that balance. That changed 3 weeks into the summer on a Thursday morning that began, as most did, with Tom stepping outside at 6:45 a.m., coffee in hand, clipboard under arm, ready to inspect the dock's tension lines. What stopped him wasn't the weather or a structural fault. It was the sight of a boat that didn't belong to him moored in his slip. A hulking, glossy leisure craft, longer than code allowed for a single slip, tied off lazily with slack lines and one fender visibly deflated. It had no visible registration on the stern, just a stylized name, C. Serafina, in cursive vinyl, curling off-center. There was a cooler still on board, a half-empty bottle of rosé leaning against the gunwale, and 2 mismatched towels drying on the railing. Tom stood there, unmoving for a moment, the early sunlight catching on the water, the faint chirp of cicadas just starting to pulse in the brush behind the seawall. He looked at the boat, then back at the channel markers. He wasn't mistaken. This was his dock, and someone had occupied it without permission. He took a slow breath, then walked back inside, calmly, as if going to check a receipt, and returned minutes later with his binder. He flipped to the tab marked Dock Access, Private, and took a photo of the permit number with his phone. He didn't storm down to the dock. He didn't rip off the lines or make a scene. He called the county access office and filed an incident report, citing unauthorized use of private dock property. They told him someone would get back to him within 72 hours. Unsatisfied but composed, he sent a second report to the Port Authority using the digital form for suspected unregistered mooring. Then he returned to his porch, sat down, and opened a new page in his logbook, titled simply, Unauthorized Vessel, Day 1. That afternoon, at approximately 4:10 p.m., a white SUV pulled into the street, parking just adjacent to the inlet road. A woman stepped out, blonde, late 40s or early 50s, athletic attire layered with coastal designer accessories, carrying a phone and reusable water bottle. She walked toward the dock with the ease of someone arriving home, completely unfazed by the presence of a boat that wasn't hers on a dock that didn't belong to her. Tom observed from the porch. She climbed aboard, pulled a bottle of sunscreen from a bag that had been left under one of the seats, and sat for a few minutes with her feet dangling into the water. Then she stood, glanced up toward the house for the first time, and waved. A polite wave, one full of social confidence and entitlement so casual it almost masked the underlying provocation. Tom nodded once, but didn't wave back. She made her way up the slope and across the short gravel path, stopping at the edge of the porch steps. "Hi there. Sorry, I should have left a note. I'm Karen. Just needed a temporary spot for my boat while the marina finishes a repair on my usual slip. This seemed like the most convenient place, and the launch guy said the access here was basically public. So, anyway, I hope it's not an issue." It was a carefully curated tone, light, smiling, with that upward vocal lilt meant to suggest that any challenge would be rude, antisocial, possibly even uncivilized. Tom looked at her for a beat longer than necessary, the breeze brushing across the porch, carrying the scent of salt, mildew, and wet fabric. He didn't respond immediately. He let the silence draw just long enough to be noticed. "That's a private slip," he said at last, evenly. "Registered, documented, legally restricted to single-owner mooring under county code." Karen tilted her head, the smile frozen but twitching at the corners. "Oh, right. Well, it's just temporary. I wasn't planning on. You've already violated mooring law and entered private property without consent. It's not a matter of how long you plan to stay. You've trespassed." The word landed hard. Trespassed. It changed the temperature of the conversation instantly. Karen's smile thinned, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she shifted tactics. "Well, I guess that's something we can just clear up with the local council," she said. "I have some good relationships there. If you'd prefer to formalize this, I'm happy to go that route." Tom stood slowly, placing his clipboard down. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply said, "If your boat isn't gone by morning, it will be reported for removal. Your decision." Karen didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She turned, walked back toward her SUV, and left without another word. That night, the boat was still there. The next morning, so was a small sign zip-tied to the piling. Community Dock Access, Pilot Program. The sign was water-damaged and slightly bent, but it bore a city seal from 3 years prior, one Tom recognized as a template used during a now-defunct shoreline initiative. It was, as far as he could tell, junk signage pulled from a municipal dumpster, but someone, likely Karen, had decided it would lend just enough artificial legitimacy to justify an escalation. It wasn't just about the boat anymore. It was about who controlled access. It was about the narrative. And Tom understood then, with a clarity that made his stomach sink. This wouldn't be settled with logic, or code, or paperwork. It would be a campaign. Slow, indirect, manipulative. And it had just begun. By the end of the third day, Tom Bowen realized he had stepped into something far less rational than a simple neighborly dispute over property boundaries. The boat was still there, its fenders now rubbing audibly against the side of the dock with each shift of tide. The slackness in the ropes hadn't been corrected, which irritated Tom not just for the risk it posed to the integrity of his pilings, but because it signaled something worse: a casual indifference to consequences. The mock sign, Community Dock Access, Pilot Program, remained, though slightly tilted, and now joined by a second laminated flyer posted awkwardly to a nearby post with a QR code and a header that read, "Support Expanded Water Access. Keep our shorelines open." It wasn't official, not even close, but the seal printed in the corner was similar enough to the city's insignia that it might pass a casual glance. Tom knew how municipal language worked, how easy it was to frame something as a public interest initiative when the real goal was simply self-benefit. This wasn't Karen misunderstanding property lines anymore. This was a deliberate maneuver, and if he didn't respond intelligently and methodically, she would reframe the issue in the eyes of their community before he had time to counter it. He started with what he did best: documentation. Not just the photos, but time-stamped video of the boat, of the flyers, of the false signage, and of his own property line clearly marked on the surveyor's stake embedded near the bulkhead. He emailed these to his attorney, not for immediate legal action, but to get everything on record. He knew from years of dealing with land disputes that whoever built the narrative first usually won the early rounds. Next, he called a contact in the city records office to request archived permitting documents from when the shoreline restoration program had briefly considered opening public slips in their area. He remembered the proposal clearly. It had been shut down due to safety concerns and overwhelming opposition, but he needed the official minutes, the voting outcome, the digital watermark to prove that what Karen was circulating wasn't just wrong, but fraudulent. Still, even as he gathered facts, Tom remained unsettled. Karen hadn't spoken to him again, but her presence was felt. 2 new kayaks appeared tied off next to her boat, neither secured properly, and both painted in a bright coral color that seemed almost intentionally loud. One evening, Tom returned from the hardware store to find a couple lounging on the dock, people he didn't recognize, drinking wine and streaming music from a small Bluetooth speaker. When he calmly asked them to leave, they acted confused. "Karen said this was a shared dock," the woman replied, as if the misunderstanding was on him. Tom didn't argue. He pointed to the boundary marker, explained the private registration, and asked them again to leave. They complied eventually, but not without muttering something about uptight retirees and gatekeeping the damn water. Tom didn't reply. He just made a note of the interaction in his log, including a description of the car they drove off in. That night, he couldn't sleep. Not from stress, not exactly. It was more the creeping realization that this wasn't going away on its own. Karen was smart, not in a technical sense, but socially. She didn't confront. She maneuvered. She used implication and optics. She knew exactly how to weaponize ambiguity, and the more Tom resisted, the more she'd spin it as resistance to progress or community. He wasn't just a private property owner now. He was being cast by implication as a gatekeeper, a curmudgeon, possibly even a low-key aggressor. All it would take was a single social media post with the right framing, and suddenly, the burden of justification would shift to him. 3 mornings later, the situation escalated. Tom walked down to his dock just before sunrise, only to find his own boat untied from its forward mooring. The stern line had been left coiled on the deck, and the bowline was dangling in the water. Thankfully, the tide had been low overnight, and the current hadn't been strong enough to pull the skiff away, but the implication was unmistakable. Someone had tampered with it, deliberately. He retrieved the line, checked for damage, and tied off again, this time adding a secondary lock loop and cinching the fenders tighter to protect from further chafing. He reviewed the footage from his surveillance camera but found nothing. The angle didn't fully capture the lower dock, a blind spot he'd always meant to correct. A mistake he wouldn't repeat. He drove straight to the city's property office. In person, no more waiting for return emails. There, he filed a formal complaint for unauthorized use of private maritime infrastructure and submitted a request to suspend any temporary dock access variances in the neighborhood pending an internal audit. While at the counter, he asked to speak directly to a compliance officer, not one of the interns or call center contractors, but someone with decision-making authority. After waiting 40 minutes, he was led into a small meeting room where a middle-aged woman named Arlene Carson introduced herself. She listened as Tom outlined the events: the unauthorized mooring, the counterfeit sign, the flyers, the presence of strangers on his property, and now evidence of tampering with his vessel. Arlene remained polite but non-committal. "We're receiving an increased number of these access disputes," she said. "It's part of a larger trend. There's a growing movement toward reclaiming water access for public use, and unfortunately, some residents, especially new arrivals, are misinterpreting that as a blanket right to shared infrastructure." Tom leaned forward. "It's not a misinterpretation. It's a manipulation. These signs are fake. The QR code leads to a shell website, and now my boat's been interfered with." She nodded slowly. "That's a more serious claim. But unless there's footage or a witness, we'd need to open a separate investigation. And I should be honest, we're not fast right now. Staffing's down, and this might not be prioritized." Tom understood what that meant. He was on his own for now. But he left the meeting with copies of his filings and a direct contact line to Arlene's office, which was more than he'd had the day before. The final straw came 2 nights later. At 2:12 a.m., Tom was woken by the distant metallic grind of something heavy being dragged. It wasn't loud, but it had that unnatural cadence that cut through sleep. He stepped out onto his porch, flashlight in hand, and scanned the dock. Nothing visible. Then he heard the engine. A low, idle, diesel, not gas, coming from the narrow waterway just out of view. He slipped on boots, grabbed his coat, and walked briskly down to the dock. As he rounded the bend, he caught sight of it. A flatbed utility barge, no lights, slowly drifting past his slip. 2 men were on it, one at the helm, another standing near the edge holding what looked like a mooring hook. They didn't dock, didn't speak, but as the barge passed, the standing man raised a hand briefly, a gesture that could have meant anything: mocking, dismissive, or maybe even a threat. Tom didn't wave back. He just watched as the barge disappeared into the next channel, leaving a faint wake behind. He stood there for a long time after they were gone, the air cold, the dock silent. Whatever was happening now, it was no longer just about Karen or the slip. This was broader. Someone was testing boundaries, watching to see how far they could push. Tom wasn't afraid. He was angry. And more than that, he was prepared. In the morning, he would call his attorney, not just for documentation, but to begin formal cease and desist filings. He'd pay for a forensic inspection of the QR code trail, trace the site registration, and file a digital fraud complaint with the state. He'd also install a secondary camera, this time under the dock, with thermal capability. This was his property, his home, and he wouldn't let it be turned into a battleground under the guise of shared access. The water looked calm that morning, but Tom knew better. That calm was a lie. The real storm was just beginning. Tom Bowen hadn't expected anything to move quickly. He knew from years of municipal experience that real change, especially the kind backed by paper, signatures, and state stamps, rarely came with urgency. But he had underestimated the velocity at which things could devolve when you were targeted by someone who didn't play by the same rules. Within 48 hours of filing his complaints and initiating the legal notices, the situation at his dock metastasized from irritating to aggressively untenable. The boat, still moored without authorization, had not only remained but now bore a freshly printed vinyl banner draped over the canopy, stretching across the back rail in breezy defiance. The banner read, "Water belongs to everyone. in large capital letters with a stylized wave graphic and the same illegitimate city seal knockoff in the corner. The image wasn't just provocative. It was calculated, made to be photographed, circulated, and framed as part of a social message rather than a property violation. And it worked. Over the weekend, strangers began appearing near Tom's dock, not in mobs or obvious protest, but in that quiet, insidious way that changes the temperature of a place. First, it was couples on rented bikes who stopped to take photos of the banner. Then a family walked by with a Labrador, pointing toward the dock and murmuring something about how good it is that someone's doing something about access. By Sunday afternoon, a folding table had appeared halfway down the gravel path leading to Tom's lot. On it sat a stack of laminated flyers, 2 clipboards with petition sheets, and a mason jar with a handwritten note taped to it. Support, equal access, donations welcome. Tom didn't touch the table. He didn't confront anyone. He simply photographed everything, time-stamped it, and uploaded it to his incident log. But the moment he stepped onto his own dock that day, the conflict became physical. Not violent, yet, but personal in a way that shocked even him. As he was checking the mooring cleats and recoiling his own lines, he noticed something sticky on the decking. It wasn't sap or algae, it was gum, mashed down into the composite grain in several spots, clearly pressed there with intent. Next to the coiled rope was a crushed beer can, empty, left just out of reach from where it could have been knocked accidentally. It had been placed there, not dropped, left like a mark, like graffiti. Tom picked it up with 2 fingers, not out of disgust, but out of the kind of cold, surgical observation that takes over when you realize you're no longer dealing with simple negligence, but calculated intrusion. He dropped the can into a sealed bag, made a note, and returned to his porch without saying a word. That night, he removed the folding table. He didn't smash it, or dump it, or leave a sign. He simply disassembled it, piece by piece, placed the materials on the sidewalk by the community recycling bins, and left it there. He knew someone would take notice. He wanted them to. The following morning, there was no retaliation. No confrontation, just a change in tone. At 9:07 a.m., Tom received an email from the City Council Liaison Office. A vague, overly polite note stating that several residents had inquired about Tom's compliance with public shoreline guidelines and that a preliminary inquiry was being scheduled to review his permits and ensure all structures met current access standards. The phrasing was intentionally neutral, but Tom read between the lines. This was the beginning of an administrative counterattack, not one based on law, but on noise, on triggering enough bureaucratic scrutiny to force him onto the defensive. They weren't trying to win legally. They were trying to exhaust him. Tom responded immediately. He included his entire digital file, copies of his permits, inspection approvals, maintenance logs, photos of the boundary markers, timestamps from his private dock license renewal, and the city's own GIS maps showing his parcel's designation as exclusive use waterfront. He added scanned affidavits from the original property acquisition file that confirmed the dock's construction date, surveyed dimensions, and private status. The reply was over 40 megabytes in attachments, and it was sent with a read receipt. Within 2 hours, he received confirmation that the review had been postponed pending a full review of submitted documentation. A delay, not a dismissal, but it gave him space, time to reinforce his perimeter in ways that mattered. He upgraded the cameras, not just in resolution but with expanded angle coverage, motion-triggered infrared sensors, and onboard SD recording that couldn't be tampered with via network interference. He added a new fixture under the dock, mounted to the crossbeam, that recorded low-angle footage of any movement within 10 feet of his skiff. He changed the locks on the side access gate. He installed a temporary sign of his own, official, accurate, printed in weatherproof laminate. Private dock access, violators subject to removal under Civil Code 46.22. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even confrontational. But it changed the visual field. It asserted presence, authority. Karen responded the next day, not through words or action, but through proxy. A man in a khaki vest and mirrored sunglasses appeared at noon, walking slowly along the edge of the waterline path with a clipboard and a measuring wheel. He didn't enter the property, didn't step on the dock, but he hovered just close enough to send a message. Tom observed him from the porch, not moving, arms folded, letting the moment sit. After 15 minutes, the man left. No contact, no attempt at dialogue. But 2 hours later, a letter arrived, hand-delivered, no return address, informing Tom that a third-party shoreline audit had been scheduled for the following Tuesday, and that he was required to provide proof of compliance in person. There was no signature, no official seal, but the formatting mimicked the city's letterhead down to the margins and font weight. It was a forgery, a well-made one, designed not to fool a court, but to spook a homeowner into second-guessing themselves. Tom took the letter directly to the city inspector's office. He showed it to Arlene Carson, who frowned as she read. "This didn't come from us," she said. "We don't schedule audits without 30-day notice, and we don't do them by mail without case number tracking." Tom nodded. He wasn't surprised, but Arlene's next words stuck with him. "You're not the first person this month to show me something like this, and I'm starting to think someone's coaching these access activists on how to simulate government pressure. If that's what this is—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The word coaching replayed in Tom's mind as he walked back to his truck. Coaching meant organization, not just casual opportunism, but coordinated messaging. A playbook. That evening, Tom scanned the flyer from the dock again, but this time he didn't just check the QR code. He looked up the domain registration. The site had been registered 2 weeks prior through a proxy shield, but the hosting server traced back to a media consultancy firm in Savannah, a firm specializing in grassroots mobilization campaigns and community-driven advocacy visuals. Tom dug deeper, carefully through archived versions, old metadata snapshots, server pathing. What he found was a list of other sites, nearly identical in layout and purpose, registered in other coastal neighborhoods, each with a variation of the same theme: opening access, reclaiming waterfronts, fighting elitist private ownership. It was a pattern. And Karen, whether knowingly or not, was acting within that pattern. Tom didn't reach out. He didn't threaten. He simply sent this data to his attorney and copied in the city liaison with a simple note: "Evidence of coordinated misinformation campaign targeting waterfront private property owners. Request immediate clarification on scope of municipal support or disavowal." No reply came that night, but the silence was not the quiet of retreat. It was the silence before another move. Tom could feel it, in the air, in the water. In the way the birds shifted uneasily at dusk. This wasn't just a neighbor gone rogue. This was something larger, something that had found its way to his doorstep. One kayak, one flyer, one false audit at a time. By the time the second week came to a close, the lines had hardened. The casual ambiguity that had once cloaked Karen's moves in neighborly charm or plausible misunderstanding had eroded entirely. What remained was something sharper, more tactical. Every bit of space contested, every interaction weighted with coded implications. Tom Bowen no longer questioned whether this was coordinated. The pattern was too precise. What he questioned now was how far it would go, and how much collateral would accumulate before someone with enforcement power acknowledged that this wasn't about ideology or community. It was about territory. His attorney, a pragmatic woman named Fallon Reeves, had already filed preliminary cease and desist paperwork naming Karen as a liable party in an ongoing trespass claim. More importantly, Fallon had advised him not to directly engage with Karen anymore. Not in person, not even by email. "She's shifting this from property law to perception management," Fallon had said. "And if she provokes you into reacting emotionally, she wins on social capital even if you hold the deed." Tom didn't argue. He understood the difference between legal ownership and public narrative. In a battle for control, facts mattered less than framing, and Karen was leveraging every unspoken rule of neighborhood culture to frame herself as the one being stonewalled by a rigid, antisocial gatekeeper. The escalation arrived in a new form the following Tuesday, just after dawn, when Tom stepped out onto his porch and saw what had been planted at the edge of his dock. A waist-high yard sign with a professionally printed surface, mounted cleanly into the soil just off his property line. The message read, "We deserve access. Support community dock reform," followed by a URL to the same recycled template site he had traced back to the media firm. The placement was strategic. It didn't technically violate his lot, but it faced his house directly, unavoidable, a declaration dressed as a plea. Next to the sign, as if for reinforcement, were 2 collapsible chairs and a crate filled with flyers. That day, for the first time, someone stayed there. A young man, early 20s, wearing sunglasses and earbuds, sat on the dock path from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., occasionally offering flyers to passers-by. He never stepped onto Tom's property, but his presence radiated challenge. A human placeholder, part of a strategy to normalize presence until it became expectation. Tom didn't react. He didn't approach the young man. He simply documented. He adjusted his camera angles to capture every minute of the occupation, then sent the footage to Fallon. She reviewed it, and within the hour, filed a new petition for injunctive relief against public obstruction and harassment via coordinated proxy demonstrators. Still, the wheels turned slowly, and the presence remained. Then came the call from his contractor. Tom had scheduled a long-overdue repair on his bulkhead wall, a standard maintenance procedure involving replacement of 2 degraded mooring plates. The crew was expected Wednesday early morning, but on Tuesday night, the project foreman called to inform him that their access had been blocked. Literally. A gray SUV, registered out of state, had been parked in front of the utility path that led down to the shore equipment drop. The crew had attempted to call the number posted on the car's windshield, likely Karen's friend or associate, but no one responded. By law, Tom couldn't authorize towing without police presence or an explicit hazard citation, and even then it would take hours. The contractor apologized and rescheduled, but warned that any further delays might affect their availability window. Tom thanked him calmly, but inside he felt the tension winding like rope under load. That night he walked the property perimeter slowly, flashlight off, letting the ambient glow of the coastal sky guide his steps. It wasn't fear driving him. He wasn't afraid of confrontation or escalation, but rather a gnawing sense that the longer this continued unchecked, the more it chipped away at his ability to live undisturbed. Property, he now realized, was not just about boundaries. It was about sovereignty, and that sovereignty had been breached. The next morning, the SUV was gone, but its tires had gouged deep ruts into the grass bordering the seawall, tearing through a section Tom had replanted only weeks prior. No apology note, no acknowledgement, just the imprint of intrusion. That was when Tom decided to accelerate. Not emotionally, but structurally. He contacted a private maritime compliance consultant, an expert in local zoning, mooring regulations, and environmental impact documentation. The man's name was Keller, a former city inspector who now offered independent verification reports for landowners embroiled in shoreline disputes. Keller arrived 2 days later, clipboard in hand, and spent 6 hours on site, measuring dock elevation, water displacement, lateral access clearance, and every other metric that might come under challenge if this went to court. By the end of the day, Tom had a 27-page document affirming the legality of every square foot of his dock and shoreline management activity. It was ammunition. Not for retaliation, but for reinforcement, for holding the line. Yet even that move did not go unanswered. On Friday morning, Tom returned from a supply run to find that someone had dumped a pile of construction debris, splintered plywood, cracked PVC piping, and insulation foam along the edge of the access trail, just far enough from the dock to avoid, constituting littering on private property but close enough to obstruct visibility. The symbolism was unmistakable. A message, staged to look incidental, meant to suggest decay, disorder, as if to say, "This is what your stubbornness earns you." Tom didn't flinch. He documented the pile, flagged it to the sanitation department, and requested expedited removal citing obstruction of emergency marine access. He didn't clean it up himself. That would have meant internalizing the cost of their act. He wouldn't give them that, but the turning point came not from trash or signage, but from silence. That weekend, no new flyers appeared. No proxy volunteers sat on the path. The banner on the boat fluttered, but was unrefreshed. For a moment, Tom thought perhaps the pushback had worked, that the reports, the filings, the cold professional consistency had finally forced Karen and her cohort to retreat. But on Sunday evening, at precisely 6:18 p.m., his motion alert pinged with an unusual notification. Movement detected in the lower dock zone. When he pulled up the feed, what he saw shocked him not because of who appeared, but because of what she was doing. Karen stood alone on the dock, windbreaker zipped halfway, a large tote slung over her shoulder. She wasn't placing another sign, or hosting guests, or filming anything. She was removing items, quietly, methodically. The banner came down first, then a set of rope buoys that hadn't been authorized, then a secondary line that had been looped into one of Tom's cleats. She untied it carefully, coiled it, and stowed it in her bag. She looked over her shoulder once, then stepped onto her boat and began adjusting the throttle. Within 15 minutes she was backing out, motor coughing slightly from idle. No grand exit. No final statement. Just absence. Tom watched in silence, unsure what to make of it. He didn't feel vindicated. He didn't feel relieved. He felt suspicious. Something about the precision of her retreat, the exact timing, the completeness of it. It wasn't surrender. It was strategy. And as the skiff's wake faded into the silvering water, Tom knew that the confrontation wasn't over. It was only entering a new phase, one where surface calm masked the next maneuver. And whatever came next, it would be louder, riskier, and far less controlled. Karen's boat disappeared from Tom Bowen's dock just as abruptly as it had arrived, but Tom knew better than to mistake withdrawal for resolution. Her retreat wasn't a concession, it was repositioning. The abrupt quiet, the absence of proxy volunteers and performative signage, the lack of any petty obstruction in the days that followed, all formed a silence too symmetrical, too coordinated to be benign. For nearly a week, nothing new appeared at the waterfront. Tom went about his routines with extra attention to detail, inspecting the cleats, checking the camera feeds, tracking even the smallest deviation in activity near the path. Everything stayed undisturbed, but tension hovered like barometric pressure just before a storm, impossible to see, but heavy enough to influence every breath. Then, on a Wednesday morning laced with brittle sunlight and a wind that felt colder than the temperature suggested, it happened. Tom had just finished securing a replacement winch cable to his skiff's side mount, a task that took careful threading through a reinforced cleat and tightening with a marine wrench, when the unmistakable roar of a tow engine echoed from the other side of the canal. The sound wasn't particularly unusual. Tow services worked the channel from time to time, pulling stranded jet skis or assisting small craft out of shallow lockups. But this engine had a more deliberate rhythm to it. Lower, steady, too powerful for minor assistance. Tom turned instinctively, eyes narrowing toward the inlet entrance. What he saw stopped him mid-motion. A crane-equipped flatbed tow truck was maneuvering, slowly but precisely, down the service trail that bordered the community dock path, navigating a tight turn it had no reason to be taking unless it had been given prior instruction. Riding low and steady, it crawled toward the space behind Karen's home, which sat diagonally across from Tom's lot, separated by a narrow inlet and a shared strip of unpaved access. Perched at the far end of her driveway was her BMW, a sleek, low-sitting silver coupe that she often used for short errands but rarely parked in visible areas. Today, it was positioned parallel to the path, partially obstructing access to the lot behind her unit, the same access used by delivery and utility crews for shoreline infrastructure. Karen stood beside the car, arms folded tightly across her chest, posture brimming with tension. She wasn't performing. There were no theatrics, no loud protests, no sweeping gestures to summon an audience. It was clear, even from a distance, that she hadn't expected the tow truck to arrive. Her mouth moved rapidly as she argued with the driver, who remained largely unresponsive, gesturing occasionally toward a clipboard mounted to his dashboard. Tom, not wanting to get involved, stepped away from the skiff and began collecting his tools, but he kept watching. The driver circled the BMW slowly, inspecting the front tires, the rear differential, and finally kneeling to assess whether there was a clearance gap for rear-wheel lift. Karen seemed to realize at that point that this wasn't a warning. The vehicle was about to be moved. Her demeanor shifted, voice rising, arms flailing slightly, foot stomping against the pavement with what looked like genuine desperation. She pointed at the car, then at the inlet, then at the house as if trying to string together some kind of rationale for why the tow could not proceed. But the driver didn't break rhythm. He simply unfolded the crane arm, lowered the wheel hooks, and signaled to his partner, a second crew member who had emerged from the cab and was now lining up the wheel harness with practiced efficiency. Tom had seen dozens of vehicles towed in his life. He'd even authorized a few removals himself on municipal projects when cars had blocked restricted work zones. But something about this one felt different. There was no legal banner framing it, no paperwork handed off, no waiting period for intervention. The action was swift, exact, and completely unceremonious. Karen, sensing that protest was futile, did something unexpected. She walked forward calmly and sat on the hood of the BMW. Not aggressively, not recklessly, just sat down, legs crossed at the ankles, hands folded in her lap, as if staking a claim not just to the car but to the narrative. Her face was tight, composed, almost vacant. Tom stood motionless, watching across the canal. The truck driver paused, radioed someone, then leaned back against the cab and waited. For 5 long minutes, nothing moved. Then, from the far end of the trail, another vehicle arrived. A black SUV with tinted windows, no municipal markings. It stopped just short of the scene. A man in plain clothes stepped out, tall, mid-40s, carrying a leather folder under one arm. He approached Karen and spoke in a low tone, gesturing toward the driver, then toward the BMW. Whatever he said caused Karen to rise slowly, stepping off the hood but not retreating entirely. She continued talking, her voice rising again, hands moving faster. The plainclothed man waited for her to finish, then handed her a piece of paper from his folder. She glanced at it, shook her head, then crumpled it and threw it into the bushes. And just like that, the crew resumed the tow. The crane arm re-engaged. The BMW's rear wheels lifted, tires rotating once before locking into place. As the car tilted upward, one of the hooks slipped momentarily, just a hitch, but it was enough to unbalance the lift. The frame rocked violently, and the back of the vehicle lurched forward. The crew scrambled to adjust, but Karen, now shouting again, had stepped dangerously close to the equipment. A command was yelled. Someone reached for a kill switch. Too late. The lift arm gave under torque, the car's weight shifting backward unevenly. The left wheel hook disengaged entirely. and in a single gut-wrenching motion, the rear of the BMW swung around, crashing into the concrete barrier before tipping sideways off the dock edge. The splash was colossal. A wall of water surged upward, drenching the lower path, cascading over the bushes and spraying back toward the tow crew. Karen screamed, an unfiltered guttural sound that pierced the inlet like a siren. She stumbled backward, shoes slipping on the wet concrete, barely catching herself before hitting the ground. The crew moved toward her, not with urgency but with caution, as though unsure whether they should assist or wait for her to recover her footing. Tom didn't move. He remained at his dock, arms resting on the railing, watching in silence. The water bubbled violently for a few moments, the BMW now almost entirely submerged, only the edge of a door visible above the rippling surface. Slowly, the tow truck backed away, its crane arm hanging useless and dripping. The plain-clothed man retrieved his folder from the ground, tucked it back under his arm, and walked away without a word. No police arrived, no emergency crews, no neighbors gathered. The entire event unfolded like a closed-loop operation. Precise, quiet, brutal. By dusk, the vehicle had been partially pulled from the water, now strapped to a retrieval barge stationed near the maintenance inlet. Tom watched the recovery from his upstairs window, not out of schadenfreude, but out of caution. He needed to see who coordinated the effort. He needed to understand the scale. The next morning, a notice was pinned to the public board near the trail. Unauthorized obstruction of emergency marine access resulted in property loss. Owners reminded to review compliance codes for all waterfront pathways. No names, no blame, just procedure. But Tom understood what had happened. Karen had pushed too far. She had anchored herself to a battle built on misdirection and pressure. But when she interfered with marine safety routes, a line that not even political theater could cross, someone higher up had acted. Not because of Tom, not because of righteousness, but because liability had entered the picture. And in bureaucracies, liability was the one force more powerful than ideology. He didn't celebrate. He didn't tell anyone. He just returned to his dock the following afternoon and spent 3 hours polishing the cleats, replacing a rusted bolt, and repainting the private access only, stenciling at the edge of the deck. The water was calm again. For now. But even in that calm, he sensed it. The next move might not come from Karen directly. It might come from someone else, someone who had been watching, waiting to see just how far the rules could bend before they snapped. And Tom Bowen, unlike before, was now fully prepared to snap them back. Tom Bowen knew that silence in conflict was never a sign of peace, only of repositioning. In the week that followed the incident with Karen's BMW being yanked into the water by a misaligned tow operation, there were no public confrontations, no flyers, no signs of defiance along the dock trail. But beneath the stillness, he could feel the recalibration. Karen vanished from her house entirely for several days. Her car, now a soggy wreck likely deemed unsalvageable, was nowhere to be seen, and her blinds remained drawn. It wasn't remorse that lingered in the air, but the pause that follows a misstep when a player with too much pride decides whether to fold or double down. And when the reappearance came, it wasn't in the form Tom expected. Not a renewed assault on the dock, not a lawyer, not even Karen. It came in a certified envelope slipped into his mailbox just before noon on a Wednesday. Tom opened it slowly, careful not to tear the return address sticker, noting the emblem embossed in the corner, County Legal Review Division, Waterway Zoning Committee. Inside was a formal summons to appear at a zoning compliance hearing regarding alleged violations of public access obstruction, misuse of permitted infrastructure, and failure to accommodate emergency egress routes as outlined in the coastal ordinances under subsection 12.04b. The phrasing was thinly veiled bureaucratic theater, but the effect was concrete. Tom was being investigated for impeding access to what Karen had apparently filed as a public-adjacent communal dock under restoration. A fictitious designation, but now one legitimized by the simple fact that a hearing had been scheduled. Not a court, not yet, but a place where records could be established, statements made under oath, and narratives crystallized into city documents that wouldn't easily be unwound. Tom's attorney, Fallon Reeves, reviewed the notice within the hour. She was calm, but her brow furrowed in the way that meant serious groundwork would now be required. "She's gone bureaucratic," Fallon said, scanning the footnotes. "This isn't about winning. It's about muddying your title just enough that any future development or sale is encumbered. If she can't take your dock, she wants to make it toxic." Tom nodded. He had already suspected as much, but hearing it spoken aloud solidified what had always been an abstract tension into a legally traceable threat. Fallon assembled a formal rebuttal package over the next 48 hours, complete with dock schematics, inspection results from Keller, time-stamped correspondence with municipal departments, and video evidence showing every false claim Karen's camp had manufactured since the first day she docked uninvited. But as the day of the hearing drew near, Tom knew paperwork wouldn't be enough. He needed clarity, not just of law, but of intent. He needed to understand who had truly been orchestrating the efforts around Karen, who had helped her design this pressure campaign masked as grassroots concern, and, more importantly, who stood to benefit. That answer came in the form of an accidental disclosure. 2 days before the hearing, Tom received an anonymous email. No subject line, no message body, just a PDF attachment titled Dock Funding Agreement Internal. He scanned it, cautious, then ran it through Fallon's secure software. It was clean. What he read made his pulse slow to a cold, deliberate rhythm. The document was a template agreement between a local environmental collective and a property management group out of Tallahassee, an entity that had previously submitted proposals to buy up aging coastal parcels for rebranding as Green Shoreline, e-access ways. The funding trail revealed that several of the flyers, QR-linked websites, and community volunteer stipends had been funneled through this group. Karen's name wasn't listed explicitly, but her block, her dock, and her parcel's GPS coordinates were. In a proposal margin, scribbled in comments, someone had noted, "Target for pilot, pressure conversion. Access conflict exploitable." Fallon reviewed it 3 times. "This is leverage," she said. "If this gets introduced at the hearing, not only does it dismantle their claim of grassroots legitimacy, it opens them to civil liability. Possibly fraud." But she cautioned, "We don't show our hand unless they force it." Tom walked into the hearing chamber 3 days later in a pressed shirt and marine boots. The room was modest, paneled in acoustic tiling, with a horseshoe table where 4 zoning committee members sat. Across from him, Karen was present, dressed with sobering restraint. No jewelry, no color, no swagger. Her posture was rigid, not from humility but from calculation. She didn't look at him as the proceeding began. The committee chair read the complaint, falsely citing community petitions, coastal redevelopment concerns, and alleged obstruction of shared marine infrastructure. Fallon stood when summoned, her tone level, her facts unshakable. She dismantled the complaint item by item, showing aerial maps, boundary confirmations, footage of Karen's unauthorized use, and finally a notarized letter from a former city employee stating that no such public-adjacent designation had ever been granted. Then she paused. "Additionally," Fallon said with the precision of a practice strike, "we have reason to believe this case was not initiated in good faith, but as part of a coordinated effort by a private third-party group attempting to discredit and apply pressure on compliant property owners under the guise of community equity." She didn't introduce the document. Not yet, just enough to lay the suggestion on record. The chair glanced up. "Do you have evidence?" Fallon smiled slightly. "We're prepared to submit, if necessary, pending committee response." There was a silence in the room that stretched long and taut. Karen shifted in her seat. The committee whispered among themselves briefly before the chair leaned forward. "We see no basis to continue this proceeding. The evidence supports the respondent. This committee finds no violation. All claims dismissed." Karen stood abruptly. She didn't speak. She walked out without acknowledgement. Outside, the air was dry, the wind high, the sky knife blue. Fallon looked at Tom and said, "It's over." But Tom didn't nod. "Not quite," he said. "That document, if we don't expose the network behind it, they'll just pick another doc, another target." Fallon hesitated, then said, "If you want to go further, we can. But this becomes federal. You'll be taking on a lot more than Karen." Tom looked toward the water. "I'm not just doing this for me anymore." The pressure faded slowly, not in a grand retreat or public admission of fault, but the way a heavy tide recedes, inch by inch, almost imperceptibly at first, until one morning the shoreline looks strangely clean and nobody quite remembers when it happened. The hearing was over, the case dismissed, the documentation sealed into the official city record with Tom Bowen's property now doubly insulated by the ruling. There were no more flyers, no more foot traffic near the dock. The artificial movement that Karen had championed, emboldened by a network of unseen hands, collapsed in silence the moment its credibility fractured in public. Karen herself didn't return to the neighborhood in any meaningful way. Her house sat dormant for weeks, then quietly went on the market under the name of a holding trust. It sold quickly, suspiciously quickly, Tom thought, and the new owners were never introduced. The boat, the signage, the disruption, all vanished. The war had ended not with a public reckoning, but with a quiet vacuum, the energy drained from the space they had tried to occupy. Tom didn't celebrate. He didn't throw a party or mark the victory with dramatic closure. He simply returned to the rhythms he'd always preferred: maintenance, inspection, a controlled existence bounded by certainty. Yet, even as he rebuilt, he carried the experience with him, not as trauma, but as a new structural layer in his understanding of ownership, of pressure, of how easily a life can be targeted not by chaos, but by calculation. The dock had been repainted, reinforced with stainless hardware, new signage installed with permanent etching and GPS trace data inscribed in microtext. He kept every page of the false complaint and every piece of evidence in a secured binder labeled Dock Siege 23. A joke between him and Fallon, but there was no bitterness in the archive, only documentation. Weeks later, Fallon met Tom for coffee at a neutral spot away from the coast. She brought a manila envelope, one final loose thread from the digital trail they had uncovered. The envelope contained correspondence between the consultancy that had sponsored the flyer campaign and a shell entity tied to a waterfront redevelopment proposal 2 counties north. "They're moving operations," she said. "Same playbook, new shoreline. This isn't over, just not your fight anymore." Tom looked at the envelope, then slid it back toward her. "Use it," he said. "Don't wait until someone else loses their home to file it." Fallon smiled faintly. "You're not like most of my clients," she said. "They're usually reactive. You're surgical." Tom didn't respond. He didn't need to. Later that month, the city quietly released a zoning policy amendment proposal, adding stricter language around third-party influence in residential access complaints. It didn't name Karen. It didn't mention Tom, but he recognized the fingerprint of what he had endured, etched subtly between the lines. It was enough. One evening, as the sun dropped low over the inlet, casting long shadows across the calm surface, Tom stood at the edge of his dock. The cleats gleamed in the light. The skiff rocked gently, secured at 3 points, each knot inspected twice. He listened to the sound of the water brushing against the pilings, the hush of wind slipping past the edge of the porch behind him. No noise, no tension, just tide, wind, and time. He had not won by overpowering the system, nor by shouting louder than the ones who lied. He had won by remaining constant, disciplined, unmoving. And when the next tide came, whoever it brought, he would be ready. Not because he trusted the system, but because he trusted himself. And that, more than any document, was his true protection.